I just saw a video and I thought I would talk about this topic. It inspired me to talk about feminism. This, everybody's talking about it these days, and it really sheds light on a lot of these questions of what is morality and what is happening with the world and so on. And this video featured women protesting on the street, and they were basically fighting against each other. So rather than it being a cohesive movement, you find that there's all these different tendencies within it, which are antagonistic. So some feminists in that group were immigrants. They were defending their interests as immigrants. And then there was another group they were fighting against who were locals. They were nationals, they were Spanish. And they began to fight, and they began to insult each other, and particularly the immigrants were calling, I find it's really interesting, the immigrant women were calling the locals whore, you white whore. And we're telling them to get out of the country, to leave the country. I find this really interesting, because it kind of shows you how all these things are reactions to something else, and because they're reactions, they need that something else to be able to be. So, for example, in this case, you see that the usual attitude of a person who wants to get rid of an immigrant is that they are defending their national identity. They're typically from that place, and they have certain cultural traits, and they want to get rid of the person who has the foreign traits. Now this is a foreigner in this case who has foreign traits and wants to kind of hijack the country and get hold of the country, and is telling the locals to get out. So I find this really interesting, because it is the opposite. It has features in common, which is the attitude of the tribalistic attitude of wanting to kick somebody out of your place. But at the same time, it is the other way around, because these people are not from there, I find it really important to analyze, because it shows that this is a tribalistic phenomenon. All these things, they're not really talking about reason. They're not talking about justice. They're not talking about what is true. They're not talking about values even, or if they're talking about values, they're talking about valuing a certain kind of community against people whom they want out, whom they want to kick out. So, also it gives the impression that, when you're a very radical feminist, for example, it gives you the impression that you're against the men. So there's a lot of confusion about this, because, of course, part of it is against the men and the men's attitude, but part of it isn't, because they're not really saying we want to kick out the men. they're not saying we want to. Imagine them saying, or we're leaving the country in order to set up a country where feminists can be left alone. We're not going to. Likewise, the men are the same. The masculinists, or whatever they are. They're not saying we're going to leave the country so that the feminists can leave us alone. No, they both want to live together badly, and they want to have the same country together, and and so on. So I find this really interesting, because it shows that it is all about tribalism, and the same thing that happens in families where the man and the woman are fighting, but they're married. and the reason they fight is because they're married. so, feminism is interesting in that way because it is a new phenomenon that is appearing, relatively recently in history, and there's not really being a masculinist phenomenon because the man has always been right, so to speak. So they've only just done their thing, the men, and they've had in civilized societies, and they've had the leading role. And that's just sort of been a giving of civilization. So that's why there's never been a movement that defends the rights of men. So, now there is, but it is just a reaction to the feminism, So, in the end, all this is trying to use the power of the state to dominate and to take advantage of others, as democracies do by taking advantage of the minority. So, the democracies, all these are systems to basically exploit other people through politics. And this is why these are kind of the moral ideologies, but they take expression in the political realm, because politics is what we use these days to impose our opinion on other people and to defeat them, and to dominate them. For our own purposes. So these days the women are getting jealous. A lot of women are getting jealous, and they use the idea of feminism and the rights of women to try to get into power and do the same men have been doing for so long in terms of exploiting the women. So it's just a reaction, and it's just a fight and a war that doesn't do us any good. So, but I found that pretty interesting. There's a woman who is an immigrant and who tells this other woman, get out of the country because you white whore, So it kind of reflects that all these kind of left-wing movements, and they favor, they have values such as allowing allowing immigration and being very tolerant and being open and so on. And in the end, it is the opposite. It is just a way to justify your superiority, and because you're just justifying your superiority, your moral superiority over other people, you're just using power, and especially because you're just contradicting yourself and you're not logical in your defense of these things. So because this is the background of it, that it's not rational, it is just appears to be rational, as I say in my work on morality, I call it pseudo-rational. So it appears to be rational, but it isn't. So because it isn't rational and it's full of contradiction, the person feels an anxiety, and it just sort of leads to the kind of madness that this video shows, where these women all fighting, and they probably are fighting over what constitutes feminism. What is, because one will define it one way and the other one will define it the other way, and the other team will define it the other way, and then they all begin to fight amongst each other. So it is that it creates tribes, groups of people that fight for power, and that's all we're talking about. This is why I define morality as a tribalistic phenomenon. So yeah, that's sort of the thoughts that I had on this video, and I wanted to share with you.